Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to an era where the scent of wood smoke mingled with the sweat of honest labor and the constant, underlying fear of, well, everything. Imagine the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, the dancing shadows of a roaring forge fire against rough stone walls. You're there, feeling the intense heat on your face, the tremor of heavy blows vibrating up through your very bones. The air is thick with acrid smoke, cold dust, and the metallic temps of iron. This isn't some cozy, romanticized vision of the past. This is the raw, gritty reality of a medieval workshop. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a single week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your muscles ache before the sun even thinks about showing its face. As a medieval blacksmith, your body is your primary tool, and it's already worn down. You stumble out of your small, damp, and probably smoky hut, the morning air biting at your skin. Your breakfast, if you're lucky. It's a chunk of stale bread washed down with some weak ale water. Isn't always safe, after all. You trudge towards the forge, a squat, sturdy building that promises both the heat you crave and the exhaustion that will consume you. The first task of the day, almost every day, is to get that beast of a forge roaring. This isn't flicking a switch. It's a careful, smoky ritual. You'll be feeding it charcoal, probably homemade and inconsistent, fanning the flames with bellows that are almost as big as you are. The smoke, thick and choking, fills your lungs, making you cough until your chest hurts. This is your life's morning coffee, a lungful of carcinogens and carbon monoxide. And speaking of morning coffee, imagine trying to get through a day of this without the modern conveniences of caffeine or, basic pain relief. You're powered by sheer stubborn necessity. Once the forge is hot enough, glowing with an orange-white intensity that makes the air shimmer, the real work begins. You pick up a piece of raw iron, rough and unyielding. This isn't the refined steel we know today. It's wrought iron, full of impurities or slag that needs to be hammered out. This process, known as fining or puddling, involved heating the iron to a near molten state and then repeatedly beating it to expel those undesirable bits. Imagine swinging a heavy hammer over and over, aiming for precision and power, while the heat from the metal radiates into your hands, up your arms, and into your very soul. You quickly learn that mistakes aren't just costly. They can be downright dangerous, sending hot sparks or even shards of metal flying. Historians still argue whether the quality of medieval iron was primarily limited by the ore itself or the refining techniques available. Either way, you're working with what you've got, and it often feels like you're fighting the metal as much as shaping it. And let's not forget the noise. The constant clang of hammer on anvil, the roar of the bellows, the sizzle of quenched metal, it's an incessant cacophony that slowly, steadily erodes your hearing. By the time you're middle-aged, if you even make it that far, communication might involve a lot of shouting and confused gesturing. It's enough to make you wish for a quiet afternoon with a good book. But alas, books are rare, and afternoons are for more hammering. The sun has barely crested the horizon, but you're already drenched in sweat, a thin layer of grime adhering to your skin. The heat from the forge is oppressive, radiating outwards in waves, and even in winter, you find yourself shedding layers. Each item presents its own challenges. A plowshare needs to be tough enough to cut through stubborn earth without breaking, but not so brittle that it shatters on a hidden rock. You're constantly gauging the metal's temperature by its color. A dull red means it's cooling too fast. A bright yellow-white means it's ready for serious shaping, to cool, and it won't move. Too hot, and it crumbles. More likely, you're paid in kind. A sack of grain, a few chickens, a portion of the harvest. While some skilled smiths in larger towns might have achieved a modest level of comfort, for the vast majority in rural settings, it was a life of unrelenting toil and very little upward movement. Your reward is simply survival, the ability to put food on your own meager table, and the satisfaction of seeing a raw lump of metal transformed into something useful and enduring. It's a pride in craftsmanship, perhaps, but it certainly doesn't pay the bills in anything resembling comfort. And the bills, if you even had them, were often simply the demands of your feudal lord. This means your personal prosperity is directly tied to the success of the local harvest, or the overall health of the village economy. If the crops fail, or disease sweeps through the livestock, your livelihood diminishes instantly. You might even find yourself working for mere room and board, just to survive. Medieval cashless economies were far more common than modern minds often assume, meaning your daily grind rarely ended with the satisfying clink of silver in your pouch. It's a delicate balance, one learned through years of trial and error, and countless ruined pieces of iron. Your arms thick with muscle, ache with a dull throb that will only intensify as the day wears on. Every swing of the hammer is calculated, a dance between brute force and subtle technique. You're not just hitting metal, you're coaxing it, persuading it to yield to your will. Your primary task for the day might be anything from forging a new plowshare for a farmer, to repairing a broken tool, or even, if you're lucky, crafting a piece of weaponry or armor. The sounds of the workshop are your constant companions. The rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the bellows, explosive hiss as you plunge a glowing piece of metal into the water trough, sending clouds of steam billowing upwards. That steam, by the way, carries with it microscopic bits of iron and other impurities, all destined for your lungs. If you have an apprentice, they are usually young, often no older than 7 or 8, and their primary role is to assist with the bellows. Fetch water, and generally learn by observation and endless repetition. There's no formal schooling, no textbooks, just the master's word and the unforgiving lessons of the forge. Their hands, though small, quickly become calloused. Their young faces are soon streaked with soot, mimicking your own. It's an occupational hazard, like the constant threat of a misplaced hammer blow catching your thumb, or a piece of hot slag flying into your eye. Safety goggles? Don't be ridiculous. Your only protection is your quick reflexes and perhaps a thick leather apron, if you're fortunate enough to own one. You're likely working alone or with 1 or 2 apprentices. Payment for your grueling labor isn't in coin very often, especially in the more rural areas. Historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths had much opportunity for social mobility or were largely stuck in their inherited trade. As the midday sun beats down, the air in the forge becomes a suffocating oven. The constant exposure to intense heat is not just uncomfortable, it's a serious health hazard. You sweat constantly, losing vital salts and fluids, leading to dehydration and exhaustion. But there's no break, no cool-down period. You push through, driven by the pile of raw materials waiting to be transformed, and the demands of your customers, few and far between though they may be. The biggest danger lurking in the air, however, isn't just the heat, it's the smoke and fumes, burning charcoal, especially in an enclosed space with limited ventilation, produces vast quantities of carbon monoxide and other noxious gases. You inhale this cocktail with every breath, leading to chronic respiratory problems. Coughs are a constant companion. Your lungs are probably thick with soot, and the long-term effects would include emphysema or even premature death. Your eyes to suffer from the constant smoke and the glare of the incandescent metal, leading to impaired vision over time. Imagine trying to thread a needle in your twilight years, when your eyes have been assaulted daily by blinding light and choking smoke for decades. It's not a pretty picture. Then there are the more immediate acute dangers. Burns are a given. You're constantly handling glowing hot metal. Sparks fly like tiny angry insects, and the forge itself is a furnace. A moment's inattention, a slip of the tongs, and you could receive a nasty burn that takes weeks to heal, if it ever does. Without access to modern antiseptics, even a minor burn can easily become infected, leading to debilitating pain, fever, and in extreme cases, gangrene and amputation. You learn to live with scars, and your hands are a testament to countless close calls. One quirky tidbit from the period is that some medieval blacksmiths believed that plunging a burned hand into a mixture of stale, urine and cobwebs would prevent infection. Spoiler, it generally didn't, and likely made things much, much worse. The sheer physical strain on your body is immense. Swinging a heavy hammer for 12 to 14 hours a day after day, year after year, takes an incredible toll. Your joints ache, your back is perpetually sore, and your hands are gnarled and calloused. You're essentially a human machine, powered by basic nutrition and an iron will. There's no ergonomic design here, no power tools to ease the load. Every single blow is delivered by your own strength, every piece shaped by your own endurance. It's a job that demands every fiber of your being, leaving you utterly spent by sundown. Historians still argue whether the average life expectancy for medieval artisans like blacksmiths was significantly higher or lower than that of the general peasant population. While their diet might have been slightly better due to more consistent income, their occupational hazards were undeniably severe. You're probably not living to a ripe old age. If you make it to 40, you're considered an elder, a survivor of a truly brutal existence. And by then, your body is likely a collection of chronic pains, stiff joints, and a persistent cough. Sleep, when it finally comes, is less a luxury and more a desperate necessity. A brief respite before the next day's arduous labor begins anew. Before you even became the weary blacksmith you are today, you endured the crucible of apprenticeship. This wasn't some structured internship with clear learning objectives and a supportive mentor. It was often a brutal, unforgiving, and deeply hierarchical relationship. You were likely a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sent away from your family either because they couldn't feed you or because they saw a slim chance of a better life for you in a skilled trade. Your education began with the most menial and unpleasant tasks, with contracts often specifying exactly what the master owed the apprentice in terms of food, lodging, and instruction. It's a sobering thought that many children who began this path simply didn't live to see its completion. Their young lives extinguished by the very trade they hoped would elevate them. By the time you finally earned the title of journeyman, meaning you could travel and work for wages. Though still not independently, you were no longer a child, but a hardened stoic individual carrying the scars, both visible and invisible, of years of relentless labor and subservience. Your body was already showing signs of wear, your spirit perhaps a little dulled, but you were a survivor, ready to face the next brutal chapter of your life. These contracts, while offering some protection, also locked the apprentice into a long period of servitude. Imagine signing away your entire youth with no real guarantee of what kind of person your master would be, or if you'd even survive the apprenticeship. You'd be sweeping the forge, hauling heavy buckets of water from the well, splitting wood for charcoal, or endlessly operating the bellows for hours on end, your arms aching long before you saw any actual metal working. Discipline was harsh and immediate. A mistake could earn you a sharp cuff to the ear, a blow from a stick, or even a denied meal. You'd start by holding pieces of hot metal with tongs, learning to anticipate your master's blows. Then, perhaps, you'd be allowed to hammer alongside him, learning the rhythm and force required. Your hands would be blistered and raw, your body perpetually tired. Every small success was hard-won, every new technique a testament to countless hours of observation and repetition. The concept of positive reinforcement was probably as alien to your master as a flying machine. It was more about, you didn't mess that up too badly this time. There was no HR department to complain to, no child protection services. Your master was your absolute authority, and his word was law. This wasn't just about learning the trade. It was about breaking you down and rebuilding you into a compliant, hard-working individual. You learned humility through constant correction and resilience through sheer physical endurance. Sleep was a luxury, often taken on a straw mat in a corner of the smoky workshop or in a cramped, unheated attic. Food was whatever scraps your master deigned to give you, often meager and unappetizing. You were essentially an unpaid servant, earning your keep through labor and obedience. As you grew older, perhaps into your early teens, you might gradually be entrusted with more skilled tasks. A quirky medieval fact is that some apprentices were legally bound to their masters for terms as long as 7 to 14 years. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates among medieval apprentices were primarily due to harsh living conditions, occupational hazards, or susceptibility to common diseases. Having survived the gauntlet of apprenticeship, you now wield a different kind of power, the power of knowing your tools intimately. Yet these tools, by modern standards, are laughably primitive, making your already back-breaking work even more arduous. Your most fundamental companion is the hammer, but not the perfectly balanced ergonomic marvels of today. Medieval hammers were often crude, made from inferior iron, and prone to chipping or deforming. You might have several, each of varying weight and head shape, but none truly designed for comfort or efficiency. Imagine swinging a lump of metal on a wooden stick for hours. Every vibration jars your bones, every misstrike sends a painful jolt up your arm. Then there's the anvil. This magnificent, heavy block of iron is the heart of your forge, the unmoving rock against which you pound molten metal into submission. But medieval anvils were rarely the polished, perfectly flat surfaces you might imagine. They were often rough, pockmarked, and made from multiple pieces of iron welded together, sometimes crudely. This uneven surface meant less predictable forging, requiring even more skill and control from you. A good anvil was a blacksmith's most prized possession, often passed down through generations, because creating one was almost as difficult as the work performed on it. Your tongs are another extension of your hands, used to grip and manipulate the red-hot iron. Like your hammers, these are forged by you, often adjusted and reforged as they wear out. The grip is rarely perfect, meaning you're constantly fighting to maintain a secure hold on slippery, glowing metal. A dropped piece of hot iron isn't just an inconvenience. It could land on your foot, burning through your crude leather shoe, or worse, bounce up and cause serious injury. One wrong move, and you're out of commission, which means no work, no food. It's a constant low-level anxiety. To measure, you rely on rough approximations, simple set of calipers perhaps, or just your eye and experience. There's no micrometer, no digital readout. Precision is achieved through feel and practice, not scientific instrumentation. For cutting, you might have a chisel and a hardy hole in your anvil to break off excess metal, or you rely on the hammer and hot cutting techniques. Everything is slower, more physically demanding, and far less precise than modern methods. A peculiar medieval tool was the swage block, a heavy cast iron block with various holes and grooves used for shaping specific components like axe heads or wheel hubs. It was essentially a multi-tool for complex forgings, demonstrating ingenuity within the limitations of the era. However, even with such aids, the work remained incredibly laborious. Historians still debate whether medieval blacksmiths developed highly specialized tools for niche tasks, or if most smiths relied on a limited set of versatile implements. What is clear is that every piece of equipment you own is a testament to your own skill or the skill of a fellow smith. There are no factories mass-producing standardized tools. Each hammer, each pair of tongs, is a unique creation, carrying its own quirks and imperfections.
Hours.
Days even, maintaining these tools, sharpening chisels, rehandling hammers, knowing that your very livelihood depends on their reliability no matter how rudimentary they might seem. Before you can even begin shaping metal, that metal itself has to exist. And in the medieval world, creating usable iron was a laborious, often inefficient, and environmentally impactful process. You weren't just buying ingots from a supplier. Sometimes, you were involved in the very first stages of transforming raw earth into something workable. This started with iron ore, which wasn't always readily available or easy to extract. It might be near a bog rich in bog iron rust-colored. Spongy deposits formed in peat bogs or closer to rocky outcrops containing harder hematite or magnetite. It's a reminder that medieval metallurgy, while rudimentary by our standards, was far from simple. Regardless, the need for charcoal meant a constant pressure on surrounding woodlands. It was a cycle of resource extraction and transformation, all leading back to that crude, unyielding lump of metal that you, the blacksmith, would finally shape into something essential for survival. Every single nail, every hinge, every plowshare represented an immense amount of human labor, from the earth to your anvil. Getting it out of the ground was often brute labor, digging with simple tools, hauling heavy baskets. Once the ore was collected, the real alchemy began, smelting. This wasn't done in your forge, but in a dedicated bloomery furnace, often located near a forest to ensure a steady supply of charcoal. Imagine a squat, chimney-like structure built of clay and stone, perhaps 5 to 10 feet tall. While still hot, you'd haul it out of the bloomery, a massive back-breaking effort, and then, with the heaviest hammers you possessed, you'd repeatedly beat it. This process, often called draining or shingling, expelled more of the liquid slag and compressed the spongy iron into a more solid billet. You're essentially squeezing out the impurities, making the iron denser and stronger. This hammering would continue, reheating the iron as necessary, until you had a relatively solid piece of wrought iron. This was the material you worked with at your forge, and its quality depended heavily on the original ore and the skill of the smelter and finer. You'd pack it with alternating layers of iron ore and charcoal. Then you'd fire it up, using bellows-massive versions of your forge bellows. Perhaps even foot-operated or water-powered, if you were lucky enough to live near a suitable stream to force air through the burning mass. The goal was to reach temperatures high enough to reduce the iron oxides in the ore into metallic iron, but not so high that the iron became liquid. The process was incredibly inefficient. Much of the iron would remain in the slag, a glassy waste product that ran off. What you were left with at the bottom of the furnace was a spongy, porous mass called a bloom. This bloom was a mixture of metallic iron, still riddled with impurities like slag, charcoal, and unreduced, or it wasn't solid, usable iron yet. Your next task, or that of a specialist finer, was to consolidate this bloom. A quirky historical detail is that some early bloomery furnaces produced iron with traces of nickel, leading historians to debate whether some iron artifacts previously thought to be meteoritic were actually products of terrestrial smelting. Historians still argue whether the widespread deforestation in parts of medieval Europe was primarily driven by the demand for charcoal, for iron smelting, or for timber for construction and fuel. Despite your indispensable role in medieval society, forging the tools, weapons, and everyday items that kept the world turning, your social standing as a blacksmith was, more often than not, remarkably low. You were essential, yes, but not revered. You were seen as a skilled laborer, a craftsman, still very much part of the working class, barely a step above the common peasant farmer. Your hands were calloused, your face perpetually grimy, and the smell of smoke and sweat clung to you like a second skin. This wasn't the stuff of aristocratic dinner parties, the rigid hierarchy of the medieval world, where status was often determined by birth, land ownership, or clerical position. A blacksmith occupied a very specific and often humble niche. You were respected for your skill, certainly, because a village without a smith was a village in deep trouble. Who would fix the plow? Who would shoe the horses? Who would make the hinges for the church door? Yet, this respect rarely translated into significant wealth or political influence. You might be consulted on practical matters, but your opinion on grander affairs of state or religion was largely irrelevant. You were probably considered part of the common folk, subject to the same feudal obligations and taxes as the farmers and laborers. You might even owe a certain number of days of labor to your lord. Forging his weapons or repairing his castle gates without direct payment, your income, as we've touched on, was often in kind rather than coin, further tethering you to the local economy and limiting your ability to accumulate wealth or move beyond your station. One quirky medieval superstition that didn't help the blacksmith's image was the occasional association with magic or witchcraft. The ability to transform raw earth into shiny, strong metal, to control fire and make sparks fly, seemed almost supernatural to the uneducated masses. While some might have seen this as a sign of special power, others viewed it with suspicion, sometimes associating smiths with dark arts, particularly if a smith was unusually reclusive or skilled. It was a fine line to walk between being admired for your craft and being feared for perceived arcane knowledge. Historians still argue whether medieval guilds, where they existed for blacksmiths, primarily served to protect the quality of the craft or to control membership and limit competition, thereby suppressing wages for non-members. In larger towns, being part of a guild might offer some protection and a slightly elevated status, perhaps allowing you to take on apprentices officially and ensuring a standard of quality. But for the isolated village blacksmith, such formal structures were rare. Your reputation was built on your own work, one repaired tool and one sharp blade at a time. It was a tough, solitary path, often without the social safety net or prestige that more gentlemanly professions might offer. You were the backbone of the community, but largely unappreciated by those who walked on it. Your role as a blacksmith wasn't just about your individual skill. It was inextricably linked to the pulse and rhythm of the medieval village economy. You were a crucial cog in a very small, very local machine. If the harvest was good, farmers had a bit more to trade, and perhaps a few more tools needed repairing or replacing. If it was bad, your work dwindled to the bare essentials, and your own stomach rumbled in sympathy with your neighbors. You were, in essence, a living barometer of the community's fortunes. meaning the smith might have access to communal resources like wood for charcoal or even a plot of land for a garden, in exchange for discounted services to the Lord or the church. This informal welfare system highlighted just how vital your role was to the functioning of the entire community, even if your actual pay was low. Consider the cycle of agricultural life. For the village blacksmith, while you relied on local custom, you also needed access to raw iron, which often came from outside your immediate area. Hinting at broader trade connections, however rudimentary, your forge was a beacon of industry in a world mostly defined by agricultural labor, a place where the sounds of human effort transformed raw materials into the very fabric of medieval life. In spring, you'd be busy sharpening plowshares, repairing harrows, and making new fittings for wagons as the fields were prepared for planting. You were called upon to forge a new iron band. A church door hinge rusted through. That was your job. Even mundane items like cooking pots might need mending. This meant your skills had to be broad, not specialized. Couldn't afford to be just a farrier or just a tool maker. You had to be proficient in a wide range of metalworking tasks, often using the same basic tools. Summer might bring requests for scythes and sickles, essential for the haymaking and early harvests. A bushel of wheat here, a side of smoked bacon there, a handful of eggs. This barter system meant you had to trust your customers to deliver on their promises, and they had to trust your work. There was no formal contract, no legal recourse for bad debts, beyond perhaps appealing to the local lord or simply refusing future work. This informal economy fostered a tight-knit, interdependent community, but also one where economic shocks reverberated quickly and severely. But it was autumn, the time of the main grain harvest, that truly dictated the year's prosperity. A successful harvest meant more grain to trade for your services, maybe even some excess to sell in a nearby market town. A failed harvest due to drought, flood, or pestilence meant lean times for everyone, including you. Farmers couldn't afford your services, and you in turn struggled to acquire food or other necessities. Beyond the agricultural rhythm, you also served as the village's general repairman, a broken wagon wheel. Payment, as discussed, was often in kind. A quirky detail is that some medieval villages had common rights for blacksmiths. Historians still argue whether the local medieval economy was primarily self-sufficient, or if it relied heavily on external trade networks for essential goods. As a blacksmith, your life revolved around the clang of the hammer and the roar of the forge. But it's worth casting a glance beyond your smoke-filled workshop to see how your lot compared to other professions in the medieval world. While your work was physically demanding and often dangerous, you were at least a skilled craftsman, which offered a modicum of independence compared to, say, the vast majority of the population. The peasant farmers. Consider the carpenter. Like you, they worked with their hands and with raw materials, wood instead of iron. Their days involved felling trees, hauling heavy timbers, sawing, planing, and joining wood to build houses, barns, and even siege engines. They faced dangers from falling timber, sharp axes, and splinters, but generally their work didn't involve the intense heat, smoke, inhalation, or flying sparks that were your daily companions. Their tools, while also rudimentary, didn't require the same level of fiery transformation as yours. Their output, however, was just as essential to the functioning of a medieval village. Then there was the tanner. If you thought your forge smelled bad, imagine the stench emanating from a medieval tannery. Tanners processed animal hides into leather, a crucial material for shoes, belts, armor, and countless other items. Their work involved soaking hides in vats of foul-smelling concoctions, often including urine and animal dung, to remove hair and soften the skin. This was an incredibly noxious and unsanitary profession, often relegated to the outskirts of towns due to the pervasive odor and waste. While perhaps less physically demanding than your work, the health risks from constant exposure to putrid materials and caustic chemicals were significant, and their social standing was likely even lower than yours. And what about the weaver? Their work was less about brute strength and more about meticulous dexterity. Weaving wool or linen into cloth was a laborious process, often done by women, involving preparing the fibers, spinning thread, and then operating a loom. While not as outwardly dangerous as blacksmithing, it was often done in cramped, poorly lit conditions, leading to eye strain and repetitive motion injuries. Their income was usually meager, tied to the production of basic textiles, a necessity for everyone. A rather unsettling yet quirky medieval profession was that of the body snatcher or resurrectionist. While not officially sanctioned, these individuals made a grim living by exhuming recently buried corpses to sell to burgeoning medical schools for anatomical study. Their work was secretive, illegal, and carried the very real risk of public outrage, severe punishment, or even a violent mob if discovered. Definitely not a career path with a clear upward trajectory. Historians still argue whether the perceived social value of a medieval trade is directly correlated with its actual income or working conditions. While you, the blacksmith, were clearly vital, your compensation and comforts were far from luxurious. It was a world of hard labor, where skill was necessary for survival, but rarely a ticket to an easy life. No matter your craft, if you worked with your hands, life was a continuous grind. A testament to sheer endurance against the backdrop of an often unforgiving world. Now, let's turn our attention from your smoky forge to another essential, yet often equally grim profession, the medieval miller. While you shape metal with fire, the miller harnesses the power of water or wind to grind grain, transforming humble raw kernels into the flour that forms the basis of medieval bread, porridge, and gruel. The air inside a medieval mill was thick with a fine, powdery dust, a constant white haze that coated everything. This wasn't just ordinary dust. It was flour dust, a mixture of finely ground grain particles, bran, and microscopic bits of stone from the grinding wheels themselves. The exposed gears, shafts, and water wheels were merciless. They were sometimes accused of thumbing the scale, taking more than their fair share of the grain as payment, or secretly diluting flour with cheaper grains or even chalk. This gave rise to the saying, "An honest miller has a golden thumb," implying such a thing was rare indeed. A loose piece of clothing, a moment of distraction. I know. You could be dragged into the turning mechanism, resulting in horrific injuries or instant death. Regardless, your life as a miller, like that of the blacksmith, was a testament to hard labor, chronic health risks, and an existence perpetually coated in the very essence of your trade, whether it was iron dust or flour dust. And like the blacksmith, your prosperity, or lack thereof, was intimately tied to the agricultural output of the surrounding land. There were no safety guards, no emergency shutoffs. The mill kept grinding relentlessly. You breathed this in all day, every day. While perhaps not as immediately caustic as forge smoke, chronic inhalation of flour dust led to severe respiratory problems, including a condition known as miller's lung, a form of asthma or bronchitis that would slowly but surely constrict your breathing. By middle age, a miller often struggled for every breath, their lungs choked with the powdery residue of their life's work. Their world, too, was one of constant labor, inherent dangers, and a pervasive, inescapable mess. In their case, dust. You'd be hauling heavy sacks of grain, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, from wagons to the mill hopper. Then, you'd be constantly monitoring the flow of grain, adjusting the gap between the massive millstones to achieve the desired fineness of flour. This required a keen eye and a strong arm, as even slight variations could result in poorly ground flour, leading to unhappy customers and less income. You'd also be responsible for maintaining the machinery, greasing gears, replacing worn components, and periodically dressing the millstones, a dangerous job, involving chiseling new grooves into the hard stone to maintain their grinding efficiency. A single slip could cost you a finger, or worse. If a heavy millstone shifted, imagine the deafening rumble of the millstones, a continuous low roar that vibrates through the entire structure. The work itself was relentlessly repetitive and often physically demanding. A unique and terrifying hazard for millers was the risk of getting caught in the machinery. A quirky historical tidbit is that medieval millers often had a reputation for being dishonest. Historians still argue whether the widespread reputation of medieval millers for dishonesty was a true reflection of their practices, or merely a common stereotype fueled by public mistrust of those who controlled essential resources. Stepping away from the specialized crafts, we turn to the vast, teeming majority of the medieval population, the peasant farmer. Their existence, unlike your blacksmithing, was not defined by fire and metal, but by earth, sun, and the relentless, back-breaking cycle of agricultural labor. This was a life of constant physical exertion, precarious survival, and an intimate, often brutal connection to the land. Imagine waking before dawn, not to the clang of an anvil, but to the call of the cock. Your home is a small one-room hovel, often shared with livestock for warmth, its floor packed earth, its roof thatched, and perpetually leaking. Your breakfast, if you have one, is likely a meager bowl of gruel made from oats or barley, perhaps some hard bread and weak ale. Then, it's out to the fields, often walking miles to reach the strips of land you are permitted to cultivate. Your tools are rudimentary: a wooden plow, perhaps tipped with iron if you're lucky, and the blacksmith is available, a hoe with a short handle forcing you to bend double all day, a hand sickle for harvesting. There are no tractors, no combine harvesters. Every furrow is turned by human muscle, every seed sown by hand, every weed pulled by your own fingers. The spring means plowing and sowing, often in cold, muddy conditions. Summer is about weeding, tending, and praying for rain, but not too much. Autumn is the frenetic, exhausting period of harvest, when every able body, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, is pressed into service to bring in the crops before the weather turns. Winter brings the crushing anxiety of whether the meager stores will last until spring, interspersed with arduous tasks like repairing tools, chopping firewood, and tending to what little livestock you possess. The constant threat of famine hung over the medieval peasant like a dark cloud. A bad harvest, a blight, a sudden flood, or prolonged drought could mean starvation for your family. There were no government aid programs, no food banks. You relied entirely on what you could grow, supplemented by what little you could forage or hunt, though hunting on the Lord. Its land was often strictly forbidden and carried severe penalties. The margin of survival was incredibly thin. One bad season could wipe out generations. A quirky historical fact, though perhaps more grim than quirky, is that medieval peasants often developed a deeply ingrained fatalism, accepting their hardships as God's will. This worldview, while perhaps offering some psychological coping mechanism, also discouraged attempts at radical change or questioning the established order. Your life was simply meant to be hard. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants genuinely held deep affection for their land and local community, despite the hardships, or if their existence was primarily one of resignation and desperate toil. Regardless, your days were dictated by the sun and the seasons, your body aching from dawn till dusk. Your future entirely dependent on the whims of nature and the demands of your feudal lord. You were bound to the land not just by custom, but by the sheer impossibility of escaping its gravitational pull. As if the relentless physical toil and constant threat of famine weren't enough, another, more insidious fear stalked the medieval peasant and craftsman alike: the specter of illness and the terrifying reality of medieval medicine. When you fell ill, your fate was often sealed by the crude, superstitious, and often barbaric practices of the day. Today, you might visit a doctor, get a diagnosis, and perhaps a prescription. In the Middle Ages, your options were grim. You might consult the local wise woman or village healer, who relied on herbal remedies passed down through generations, many of which were utterly useless and some actively harmful. She might offer a poultice of mashed herbs or a potion brewed from roots and leaves. The belief was that the vitality of the deceased would transfer to the living. Regardless, when sickness struck, you knew it was a gamble with incredibly high stakes. Your best hope was a strong constitution and sheer luck, because the healers of the day, despite their best intentions, often offered little more than prayer and painful interventions. Your body was resilient, but it was constantly at the mercy of invisible killers and well-meaning, but ultimately harmful treatments. Unsurprisingly, this was not only ineffective, but also contributed to the spread of disease. If you were lucky, some of these might have had mild analgesic properties. If unlucky, they could be poisonous. Imagine waking one morning with a fever, chills racking your body, and a cough that tears at your lungs. The prevailing medical theory, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman texts, was the theory of humors. This held that the body was composed of 4 basic fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors. The cures were often designed to restore this balance, usually by purging the body. This led to practices like bloodletting, where a barber surgeon would literally open a vein and drain a quantity of your blood, believing it would remove the bad humors causing the illness. Or you might be given powerful emetics to induce vomiting or purges to cause severe diarrhea. These treatments often weakened an already sick patient, making them more susceptible to further infection or simply hastening their demise. Pain relief was almost non-existent. For a toothache, the barber surgeon might simply pull the offending tooth with crude pliers, without anesthetic, leaving you with a gaping, bleeding hole. For a broken bone, they might attempt to set it. But infection was a near certainty, and a badly set limb could leave you crippled for life. Surgeries, when performed, were incredibly risky, often done without sanitation and with agonizing pain. A simple cut could turn deadly through infection, leading to gangrene and requiring amputation, again, without effective pain management. You might be given a strong dose of opium or mandrake, if available, but these were crude and dangerous. A particularly macabre, yet quirky medieval remedy for various ailments, including epilepsy, was to drink powdered mummy or human blood, often obtained from executed criminals. Historians still argue whether the placebo effect played a significant role in the perceived efficacy of some medieval medical treatments, given the strong faith-based context. If the thought of medieval medicine sends shivers down your spine, just wait until we delve into the realm of medieval personal hygiene. Prepare yourself, because it's a far cry from your modern daily shower and meticulous dental routine. In fact, it was often a world of pervasive smells, grime, and practices that would make your stomach churn. First, let's talk about bathing. For the average peasant or even craftsman like you, a full-body bath was a rare event. It wasn't a daily ritual. It might happen a few times a year, perhaps in a large wooden tub if you were fortunate enough to own one. And the water would likely be heated over a fire, a laborious process. Wealthier individuals and those in larger towns might have access to public bathhouses. But these were not always common, nor were they consistently clean or free from the spread of disease. For most, bathing involved a quick wipe down with a damp cloth, or perhaps a dip in a cold river or stream during warmer months. The idea of washing your hair with shampoo was completely foreign. Your hair was likely greasy, matted, and home to a thriving ecosystem of lice and fleas. Speaking of unwanted companions, lice and fleas were an unavoidable fact of life. They lived in your hair, your clothes, your bedding, and even your pets. Getting rid of them was a constant losing battle. You might try to pick them out, or use herbal concoctions, but they always returned. This constant itching and scratching was just another layer of discomfort in an already uncomfortable existence. Dental hygiene was practically non-existent. Brushing your teeth with toothpaste, it's a concept centuries away. You might occasionally chew on certain herbs or rub your teeth with a rough cloth, but regular cleaning was not practiced. The result was widespread tooth decay, gum disease, and chronic bad breath. Remember the barber surgeon from the last section? He was often the one tasked with pulling those rotting, painful teeth. It's a miracle anyone had a full set of teeth past their 20s. So imagine the collective breath of a crowded medieval market. It's enough to make you wish you had a gas mask. And then there's sanitation, or the shocking lack thereof. Latrines, where they existed, were often simple pits. In rural areas, people simply relieved themselves wherever convenient. Behind a bush, in a field, or directly into the street in more populated settlements. Waste, both human and animal, accumulated in streets and alleyways, especially in towns, attracting flies, rats, and disease. There was no concept of plumbing or waste disposal systems as we know them. The smell, especially in summer, would have been overwhelming. A pungent cocktail of decaying organic matter, unwashed bodies, and animal waste. One particularly stomach-churning, yet historically documented, quirky habit was the practice of some medieval people using moss, hay, or even leaves as a form of toilet paper, which, as you can imagine, was not particularly effective. And if you think that's bad, sometimes they simply used their hand and then rinsed it. ... or didn't. Historians still argue whether the occasional plague outbreaks were solely due to bacterial and viral factors or significantly exacerbated by the utterly deplorable hygiene and sanitation practices. Regardless, the daily reality was a constant battle against filth. body odor, and the tiny, unseen enemies that thrived in such conditions. Your world was a sensory assault, and unfortunately, your nose was constantly on the front lines. Having navigated the olfactory landscape of medieval hygiene, let's turn to another fundamental aspect of survival: food. For the vast majority of medieval people, including yourself as a blacksmith, food was not a delightful culinary adventure. It was a constant preoccupation, a battle against scarcity, and often an unappetizing necessity. Bread, usually a dense, coarse loaf made from rye, barley, or oats, was the cornerstone of every meal. It was often hard, sometimes stale, and probably contained bits of grit from the rudimentary milling process, leading to worn teeth over time. Along with bread, you'd consume large quantities of pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew made from whatever vegetables were available, possibly some herbs, and if you were exceptionally lucky, a tiny piece of meat or fish. These were pies made from whatever could be found, even rumored to include rats or other vermin, disguised to be more palatable. What is undeniable is that every meal was a calculation, a careful management of meager resources, and a constant reminder of your precarious position in a world where hunger was always just one bad harvest away. Your survival was a testament not to a balanced diet, but to sheer caloric intake, however unappetizing or monotonous. It's a stark reminder of the lengths people went to in order to survive. This pottage was often made in a single pot over the fire and could be reheated and added to 4 days, developing new flavors, or simply getting more sour. Forget gourmet meals or diverse diets. You were eating to live, not living to eat. Your daily diet revolved around the most basic and available staples. Grain was king. Meat was a rare luxury for most common folk. If you had access to it, it was likely salted or smoked to preserve it, as refrigeration was, of course, non-existent. During the harvest, you might enjoy them, but for most of the year, your vegetable intake came from root vegetables stored in cool cellars or preserved in brine. These fermented beverages had a lower alcohol content than modern beer and wine, making them safer than untreated water, and they also provided some caloric intake. Imagine starting your day with a weak ale instead of coffee. It sounds appealing until you remember it's essentially your primary hydration source. All day, every day. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a real threat, especially during long winters when fresh produce was scarce. You might get a small piece of pork from a pig you raised, or perhaps some chicken or rabbit, boring. Beef was generally too valuable, often reserved for the lord or for sale in markets. Fish, especially freshwater fish, might be more common for those living near rivers or lakes, but again, preservation was key. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal and perishable. Water, often unsafe to drink, was frequently replaced by ale or cider, even for children. A truly unsettling, yet historically documented, quirky aspect of medieval food was the occasional consumption of resurrection pies during desperate times of famine. Historians still argue whether the medieval diet, despite its monotony and occasional scarcity, was nutritionally adequate for sustaining a physically demanding life, or if chronic malnutrition was widespread. Beyond the daily struggle for food and the constant threat of disease, another chilling reality pervaded medieval life: the harsh and often arbitrary nature of the justice system. If you found yourself accused of a crime, your chances of a fair trial, as we understand it, were slim to none. The medieval legal landscape was a terrifying labyrinth of local customs, feudal power, and divine judgment, often with brutal outcomes. Imagine you're accused of stealing a pig from your lord's steia, common crime born of desperation. There's no nuanced interrogation by skilled detectives, no forensic evidence. Justice was swift and often based on testimony, reputation, or even trial by ordeal. One mainstream historical fact is that trial by ordeal was a widely accepted method of determining guilt or innocence. This involved subjecting the accused to a dangerous and often agonizing test, with the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent. Consider the ordeal by hot iron. You would be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for a certain distance, or plunge your hand into boiling water. Your hand would then be bandaged, and after 3 days, if the wound was healing cleanly, you were declared innocent. If it was infected or festering, you were deemed guilty. Of course, given the lack of sterile conditions, infection was almost guaranteed, making conviction a near certainty for most. There was also the ordeal by water, where you'd be thrown into a body of water. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. It was truly a lose-lose proposition for the accused. Punishments for even minor infractions could be severe. Theft, depending on the value of the stolen goods and the Lord's temper, could result in anything from public flogging, mutilation, or even hanging. There were no prisons in the modern sense. Jails were typically holding cells for those awaiting trial or execution, not places for long-term incarceration. If you were found guilty, the sentence was carried out quickly and publicly, serving as a grim deterrent for others. A quirky and somewhat horrifying legal practice in some areas was the concept of benefit of clergy. This meant that if you could read a passage from the Bible, you could claim to be a cleric and be tried by an ecclesiastical court, which often handed down lighter sentences, usually without the death penalty. This created a loophole where simply being literate, regardless of actual clerical status, could save your life. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of medieval punishments was deterrence, retribution, or public spectacle. What is clear is that the system was designed to maintain order in a volatile society, often at the expense of individual rights or genuine justice. As a common person, you lived under the constant threat of arbitrary power and a legal system that offered little mercy, relying more on divine intervention than on due process. It was a world where a wrong accusation, or just plain bad luck in an ordeal, could swiftly bring your already challenging life to an abrupt and painful end. If the thought of the medieval justice system doesn't make you want to stay put, consider the actual act of medieval travel. Forget comfortable carriages, paved roads, or even the concept of a quick journey. To travel in the Middle Ages was to embark on a perilous, exhausting, and often terrifying odyssey, where every mile brought new challenges and dangers. Imagine you need to visit a neighboring town, perhaps a day's journey away, to acquire specialized materials for your forge that aren't available locally. You set out on foot, as owning a horse or even a sturdy cart is a luxury few, including most blacksmiths, could afford. These crossings were often treacherous, especially after heavy rains. With strong currents capable of sweeping you and your meager belongings away, while on a spiritual journey, they were still subject to all the same dangers as any other traveler, sometimes even more so, as they often carried offerings or relied on charity. Regardless, the perception of peril was very real, influencing how and when people dared to travel. Every journey was an act of courage, a gamble against the odds. So, while you might escape the daily grind of the forge for a brief respite on the road, you were trading one set of hardships for another, perhaps even more terrifying, array of uncertainties. You might encounter them, sharing a brief moment of camaraderie on the arduous path. The concept of safe, reliable infrastructure was centuries away. The roads are a little more than dirt tracks, rutted by carts, turned into muddy quagmires by rain, or choked with dust in the dry season. They wind through dense forests, across open plains, and over unbridged rivers. There are no signposts, no reliable maps as we know them. You rely on local knowledge, the sun's position, and perhaps the occasional crude landmark. The journey itself is physically draining. Your feet ache, your clothes become caked with mud or dust, and you're constantly exposed to the elements. Finding shelter for the night is another challenge. You might rely on the hospitality of a sympathetic villager, seek refuge in a monastery, or if desperate, simply sleep by the roadside, wrapped in a cloak. Inns, where they existed, were often expensive, crowded, and not always safe. But the physical discomforts were often overshadowed by the pervasive dangers. Banditry was a constant threat. Outlaws lurked in forests and along lonely stretches of road, preying on travelers. A lone traveler like you, carrying any valuable goods, was a prime target. You might carry a simple knife for self-defense, but a group of armed bandits would easily overpower you. Beyond human threats, wild animals like wolves were a genuine concern, especially if you were forced to camp in the wilderness. Navigating rivers without bridges meant finding a ford, where the water was shallow enough to cross, or relying on small, unstable ferries. A quirky yet common sight on medieval roads was the pilgrim, often dressed in distinctive garb, carrying a staff and wearing a scallop shell symbol. Historians still argue whether the actual frequency of attacks on medieval roads was as high as contemporary accounts suggest. or if popular fear exaggerated the dangers. If you thought escaping the forge or the road offered true freedom, think again. Your existence, like that of almost everyone in the medieval period, was largely dictated by the immense, overarching power of the feudal lord. Whether he was a duke, a count, a baron, or simply the local knight, his authority was absolute within his domain. And you, the blacksmith, along with every peasant, tailor, and miller, were bound by his will. Imagine the lord's castle or fortified manor house looming over your village, a constant physical reminder of his power. You and your family lived on his land, worked his land, and were subject to his laws, not some distant kings. This system of feudalism meant that in exchange for protection, you owed him a myriad of duties and payments. This wasn't a choice. It was the fundamental structure of your society. Your obligations could include working a certain number of days a week on the lord's domain, without pay, essentially providing free labor. This meant precious time away from your own fields or forge. You might have to provide a portion of your own harvest or earnings to him as rent, even if your crops were meager. If you needed to marry, or if your daughter wished to marry someone from outside the lord's domain, you often needed his permission and might have to pay a fee. Your movement was restricted. You could unsimply pack up and leave to find work elsewhere, without facing severe penalties for abandoning your feudal obligations. The lord also held the power of justice. As we've discussed, there were no independent courts. His bailiff or seneschal would preside over local disputes, and his word was often final. He could levy fines, impose punishments, and even call you up for military service if he needed able-bodied men for his personal retinue or for a local skirmish. Your life, in essence, was not entirely your own. A quirky, yet revealing aspect of feudal dues was the droit du seigneur, or jus primae noctis, the right of the lord to the first night with a peasant bride. While historians still hotly debate whether this was a literal practice or more of a symbolic tax or fine, the belief in its existence certainly highlighted the terrifying extent of a lord's perceived power over his subjects' lives and bodies. It was a brutal reflection of the lord's ultimate claim on everything and everyone within his domain. Historians still argue whether the feudal system provided a necessary degree of stability in a chaotic post-Roman world, or if it was primarily an exploitative system designed to maintain the power and wealth of the land-owning elite. Regardless, for you, the common person, it meant living under a constant state of obligation and subservience. Your lord was a fact of life, an omnipresent force that shaped your daily routine, limited your opportunities, and reminded you constantly of your humble place in the grand scheme of things. Even if you were the finest blacksmith in the land, you were still, first and foremost, the lord's blacksmith. If your feudal lord's absolute power was enough to make your life a continuous tightrope walk, then the crushing burden of taxation certainly was. Forget filing your annual tax returns. In the medieval world, taxes weren't a predictable percentage of your income. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a religious obligation. You were expected to give 1/10 of everything you produced, whether it was your grain, your livestock, or even the iron goods you forged to the local parish priest. You might be called upon to repair the lord's castle walls, dig ditches, clear land, or even serve in his army for a set number of days each year, completely without compensation. This was time taken away from your own productive work, directly impacting your ability to provide for your family. Imagine having to hand over 1 of every 10 plowshares you made, or 1 out of every 10 eggs your chickens laid, all for the spiritual well-being that often felt abstract against the very concrete demands of your stomach. It was a clear demonstration of how even the most basic aspects of daily life could be subjected to feudal levies. Social injustice and religious fervor, regardless of the exact trigger, for you, the common person, taxes were a constant drain on your already meager resources. A reminder that much of your sweat and toil ultimately served someone else's grandeur. You lived in a world where tax season was every season, and evasion was not an option, but a direct path to ruin. This went to support the clergy, maintain church buildings, and contribute to the vast wealth of the church hierarchy. But a myriad of arbitrary levies, often demanded in kind rather than coin, and collected with an unyielding hand. You worked tirelessly at your forge, but a significant portion of your output, your very survival, siphoned off to support the lavish lifestyle of your lord, the church, and sometimes a distant king. One of the most pervasive forms of taxation was the tithe, a mandatory payment to the church. Beyond the tithe, your feudal lord imposed his own set of taxes and dues. There was the aforementioned rent for your land, often paid in grain or labor. But then there were the countless, often seemingly arbitrary fees. You might pay a fee to use the Lord's mill to grind your grain. You might pay a fee to use the Lord's oven to bake your bread. There were tolls to cross bridges or use certain roads, fees for holding markets, and special levies to fund your Lord's wars or rebuild his castle. These were not fixed, could be increased at the Lord's whim, especially in times of need or greed. You had little recourse to protest. Refusal to pay could lead to severe penalties, including seizure of your property or even physical punishment. There was also the labor, a form of tax paid in forced labor. Particularly absurd, yet historically documented, quirky tax in some regions of medieval Europe was the smoke penny, a small annual payment levied on every chimney, essentially a tax on each household. Historians still argue whether the cumulative burden of medieval taxes and feudal dues was the primary driver of peasant rebellions, or if these uprisings were more complex, stemming from a combination of economic hardship. If your life was already sufficiently dominated by the demands of your lord and the brutal reality of the harvest, there was another colossal power shaping every facet of medieval existence: the church. Far more than just a place of worship, the medieval church was a ubiquitous, immensely wealthy, and often intimidating institution that wielded enormous spiritual, economic, and even political influence over your daily life. Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning. Attending Mass at the local church isn't just an option. It's a social obligation, a spiritual necessity, and a public demonstration of your piety. The church building itself, often the grandest structure in the village, symbolizes its pervasive authority. You would hear sermons delivered in Latin, a language you likely didn't understand. But the moral lessons and the fear of eternal damnation were clear enough. It's conveyed through powerful imagery and the stern pronouncements of the priest. The church's power wasn't merely spiritual. It owned vast tracts of land, often more than any single feudal lord. It collected rents and services from its tenants, just like secular lords. Remember that tithe we discussed? It's 1/10 of your produce straight to the church? This made it incredibly wealthy, accumulating treasures, building magnificent cathedrals, and funding monasteries that served as centers of learning and charity, but also as formidable economic entities. Beyond property and tithes, the church held immense moral authority. It defined what was right and wrong, dictated holidays and fast days, and controlled access to the sacraments baptism, marriage, confession, and last rites, which were believed to be essential for salvation. The threat of excommunication, being cast out from the church community, and denied the sacraments was a terrifying prospect, effectively condemning your soul to hell in the eyes of everyone, including yourself. This was a powerful tool for social control. A quirky yet revealing aspect of the church's influence was the concept of sanctuary. If you committed a crime, you could sometimes seek refuge in a church or monastery. The church jurisdiction over its sacred spaces meant that secular authorities generally couldn't arrest you inside, at least not immediately. This offered a brief respite, though you would eventually have to face some form of justice. Often after negotiating with the ecclesiastical authorities, it highlighted the parallel and sometimes conflicting power structures of the church and the secular state. Historians still argue whether the medieval church primarily acted as a force for social stability and moral guidance, or as an oppressive institution that stifled intellectual inquiry and maintained a rigid social hierarchy. For you, the common person, the church was an undeniable fact of life, weaving its way into every celebration, every sorrow, and every fear. It promised salvation in the afterlife, but demanded unwavering obedience and considerable material support in this one. Your spiritual journey was as much a part of your daily grind as the physical one, constantly under the watchful eye and often heavy hand of the omnipresent medieval church. Given the immense influence of the church, it's no surprise that pilgrimages were a significant aspect of medieval life, offering a blend of spiritual devotion, penance, and for some, a rare opportunity to see beyond the confines of their village. But for the average person like you, embarking on a pilgrimage was not a quaint vacation. It was an undertaking of monumental hardship, fraught with the very dangers we've discussed and more. The local priest might suggest a pilgrimage to a nearby shrine, or for the truly devout, to a major site like Canterbury, Rome, or even Jerusalem. The promise of spiritual reward was immense. A plenary indulgence, a miraculous cure, or the chance to kneel before sacred relics. Imagine the decision. Perhaps you or a loved one fell gravely ill, or you sought forgiveness for a sin, or simply hoped to gain divine favor. Now amplify them. The terrible roads, the constant threat of bandits, the lack of clean water and safe food, and the exposure to the elements. Regardless of the individual motivation, the journey was a profound disruption to your already precarious life. A massive investment of time, energy, and what little resources you possessed. You would return, if you returned at all, physically transformed by the ordeal, bearing the scars of the road, but perhaps also carrying a renewed sense of purpose or a quiet conviction of spiritual blessing. For many, the arduous path was the penance, the true test of faith, making the destination almost secondary to the journey itself. You'd sleep rough, rely on charity or overcrowded, unsanitary pilgrim hostels, and carry only what you could on your back. Your feet would be blistered, your body exhausted, and your spirit tested by every mile. But the reality of the journey itself was brutal. You would likely walk hundreds, even thousands of miles. Remember the perils of medieval travel? For many, the physical suffering was part of the penance, a tangible demonstration of their faith and commitment. You might even deliberately undertake the journey barefoot, or in sackcloth, to increase the spiritual merit. Shrines often housed bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, or other holy objects. Pilgrims would often purchase small leaden badges or ampulla containing holy water or oil that had touched these relics, bringing them back as tangible proof of their journey and as objects of protection. The demand for these often led to rampant forgery, with unscrupulous individuals selling fake relics to eager, devout pilgrims. The further the destination, the greater the perceived holiness of the act. Meeting other pilgrims from different regions, perhaps even different countries, would have been a rare glimpse into a wider world. A fleeting sense of shared humanity amidst the individual suffering. A quirky yet telling aspect of medieval pilgrimages was the trade in relics. Historians still argue whether medieval pilgrimages primarily served as genuine expressions of deep personal faith, or if they were often undertaken out of social pressure, a desperate search for miraculous cures, or even as a form of coerced penance, as if the daily grind, the looming threat of famine, disease, and the iron grip of Lord and Church weren't enough. Another, more cataclysmic force frequently ripped through the fabric of medieval life: warfare. Forget the sanitized, distant conflicts of modern times. In the Middle Ages, war was brutal, personal, and utterly devastating, often brought directly to your doorstep. Imagine the sound, not just the distant rumors, but the actual thundering of hooves, the shouts of men, the clanking of armor. When two lords squabbled over a strip of land or a king decided to assert his authority, it wasn't professional armies clashing in distant fields. It often meant your village, your fields, your very forge became a battleground, or worse, a target. Feudal levies meant that male peasants, sometimes even yourself, if you weren't deemed more valuable at your trade, could be conscripted into makeshift armies armed with whatever crude weapons were available: a spear, a farm implement, perhaps even a short sword if you were lucky. You were untrained, poorly equipped, and utterly expendable. The primary goal of medieval warfare wasn't necessarily to kill every enemy soldier, but often to destroy the enemy's ability to wage war, which meant destroying their resources. This often translated into scorched earth tactics. Imagine watching from a hidden ditch as raiding parties sweep through your village, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, looting homes, and then setting fire to the very buildings you knew, your small hut, your carefully cultivated field. Your essential tools all could be reduced to ashes in a single brutal afternoon. For you, the blacksmith, the demands of war might bring temporary work, forging arrowheads, repairing armor, or shoeing war horses. But this brief surge in business came with the terrifying knowledge that the very tools you made might soon be used against your own community. And if the fighting drew near, you might have to abandon your forge, fleeing with your family to the dubious safety of a fortified town or the Lord's castle, leaving everything you owned to the mercy of passing armies. A particularly grim, yet historically pervasive aspect of medieval warfare was the practice of taking ransoms. Noble captives were valuable, held for huge sums of money rather than killed. For the common soldier or peasant caught in the crossfire, however, there was no such value. You were simply a casualty of war, killed or left to die, your body indistinguishable from the thousands of others littering the battlefield after a skirmish. Historians still argue whether medieval warfare, despite its apparent chaos, followed unwritten codes of conduct among the nobility, or if it was almost universally brutal and indiscriminate. Regardless of the intentions of the commanders, for the common folk, war was an unmitigated disaster. It meant starvation, displacement, death, and the complete destruction of the fragile life you had painstakingly built. The threat of conflict was an ever-present anxiety, a reminder that even if you survived the daily grind, your very existence could be shattered in an instant by the clash of steel and the ambition of powerful men. If open warfare was a sudden, violent storm, then siege warfare was a slow, agonizing suffocation. When an army couldn't decisively defeat its enemy in the field, or when a heavily fortified castle or town needed to be taken, a siege commenced. And for anyone caught inside, it was a living nightmare of deprivation, terror, and relentless pressure. Imagine your lord's castle, usually a symbol of protection, now becomes a trap. As a blacksmith, you might be pressed into service, helping to reinforce gates, sharpen weapons, or even construct rudimentary defensive mechanisms. You might be pressed into bucket brigades to fight fires, or help load projectiles for the defenders. Regardless, for those trapped within, it was a prolonged, excruciating ordeal, a slow-motion descent into hell. You'd witness friends and families succumb to hunger, disease, or the enemy's assault. And if you survived, you would emerge from the siege into a landscape of devastation, your home likely destroyed, your community shattered. Carrying the indelible scars of a prolonged and terrifying imprisonment, every moment is lived with the knowledge that the walls could be breached at any second, leading to a brutal assault. When a castle finally fell, the consequences for those inside were dire. The victorious army often engaged in widespread slaughter, looting, and rape, regardless of whether you were a soldier or an innocent civilian. There was no Geneva Convention. But once the besieging army sets up camp, often numbering in the thousands, the outside world ceases to exist. All supply lines are cut. No fresh food, no clean water, no escape. The first and most immediate consequence is hunger and thirst. Food stores, carefully rationed, dwindle rapidly. People resort to eating anything: dogs, cats, rats, leather, even the straw from their beds. Catapults hurl massive stones, sometimes diseased animal carcasses, or even the heads of captured enemies over the walls. Siege towers lumber towards the ramparts, filled with enemy soldiers. Miners might tunnel beneath the walls, attempting to collapse them. The noise is constant. The thud of siege engines, the shouts of attackers and defenders, the screams of the wounded. Sleep, if it comes at all, is fitful and terrifying, interrupted by sudden attacks or the terrifying sound of a wall cracking. Water becomes a precious commodity, often contaminated or severely limited. Disease, fueled by malnutrition and overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, spreads like wildfire. Remember our discussions on medieval hygiene and medicine? Imagine those conditions amplified tenfold within a confined space, with no way to remove the dead or tend to the sick effectively. Then comes the relentless assault. Your role, if you're a civilian inside, is one of desperate survival. Historians still argue whether medieval siege warfare was primarily a test of endurance and logistics, or a psychological battle designed to break the morale of the besieged. Amidst the pervasive hardships of medieval life, from the anvil's clang to the siege's despair, one segment of the population faced perhaps the most vulnerable and often tragic existence. Children. Forget childhood as a time of innocence, play, and protected development. For medieval children, life was a brief, precarious journey. often ending before adulthood and filled with demands that would shock modern sensibilities. Imagine yourself as a child in the medieval world. From a very young age, perhaps as early as 3 or 4, you were expected to contribute to the household economy. There was no concept of mandatory schooling, no playgrounds dedicated solely to recreation. Your play was often intertwined with work, mimicking the adults around you. Boys might help their fathers in the fields, scaring birds from crops, or gathering firewood. Girls would assist their mothers with spinning wool, fetching water, or tending to younger siblings. Your toys, if you had any, were simple. A wooden doll, a carved animal, or perhaps a ball made of rags. Formal education was a rare luxury, almost exclusively reserved for boys of noble birth, or those destined for the clergy. For the vast majority, literacy was a distant dream. Your education came from observing and participating in the daily tasks of your family and community. You learned by doing, by watching your father at the forge, or your mother at the loom. The terrifying reality for medieval children was the incredibly high mortality rate. A mainstream historical fact is that infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. It was common for a medieval family to lose half or even more of their children before they reached adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and a complete lack of modern medical care meant that simply surviving infancy was a monumental achievement. A parent's heart was undoubtedly hardened by this constant threat of loss. To invest too much emotional attachment in a child who might not see their 5th birthday was a luxury few could afford. At the age of 7 or 8, your childhood often ended abruptly. As we discussed, boys might be sent away as apprentices to a craftsman like yourself, or to work as pages in a noble household. Girls, too, might be sent to service in other homes or begin serious preparations for marriage, which could happen as early as their mid-teens. Your life trajectory was set, and it involved hard labor and adult responsibilities. Rather unsettling, yet quirky. Detail is that medieval art often depicted children as miniature adults, with adult proportions and clothing. This wasn't necessarily because they didn't understand how children looked, but often reflected the societal view that childhood was a fleeting preparatory stage for adult labor and roles, rather than a distinct period of life. Historians still argue whether medieval parents, despite the high mortality rates, experienced grief for their deceased children with the same intensity as modern parents, or if societal norms and constant exposure to death led to a more resigned acceptance. Regardless, for the children themselves, life was a continuous struggle for survival, a rapid journey from infancy to a demanding adulthood. With little room for the carefree wonder that we associate with childhood today, every year you survived was a victory, a testament to your own resilience in an unforgiving world. If medieval childhood was brutally short for medieval women, life was often a tapestry woven with severe limitations, demanding labor, and a societal framework that consistently placed them in a subordinate role. You will likely marry, bear children, and manage a household. For a peasant girl, it was often arranged by her parents, potentially with the lord's approval, to secure land, labor, or simply to ensure both families had enough mouths to feed and hands to work. You might be married as young as 14 or 15, and your primary duty within marriage was to bear children, especially sons, to ensure the continuation of the family line and labor force. A mainstream historical fact is that women generally had few legal rights independent of their fathers or husbands. Before brewing became a formalized, male-dominated industry, it was often a domestic task, and women were the primary producers of ale, sometimes selling their surplus to supplement household income. This brief flicker of female entrepreneurship was, however, usually confined to the household sphere. They could not own property in their own name, could not generally testify in court, and their word often carried less weight than a man's. Their opportunities for advancement or even personal agency were severely restricted by law, custom, and religious doctrine. Childbirth, given the complete lack of medical understanding and hygiene, is incredibly dangerous, a leading cause of death for medieval women. Many women would endure multiple pregnancies, often losing several children, and eventually their own lives in the process. Regardless, your life as a medieval woman was a constant negotiation of societal expectations and profound physical demands. Often with little personal recognition, or opportunity for self-determination. You existed fundamentally to serve your family and your community, your voice often unheard. Your contributions often unacknowledged beyond the domestic sphere. Your education, if any, would be centered around domestic skills. Cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, tending a garden, and caring for livestock. These were essential skills for survival, but rarely recognized as formal training. You learned from your mother and other older female relatives, absorbing knowledge through constant observation and participation. Forget notions of equality or broad career choices. Your life as a woman in the Middle Ages was largely defined by your marital status, your family's social standing, and the omnipresent patriarchal structures of the era. Imagine yourself born female in a medieval village. From infancy, your future path is largely predetermined. Marriage was less about romantic love and more about economic and social alliances. Within the household, women often had significant responsibilities, managing the domestic economy, preparing food, making clothes, and often assisting with agricultural tasks, especially during harvest. If you were the wife of a craftsman like a blacksmith, you might assist in the workshop with lighter tasks, like operating bellows or polishing finished goods. But the heavy, skilled labor was almost exclusively the domain of men. One of the more frustrating yet universally accepted limitations was the legal status of women, a quirky and somewhat empowering exception to the typical female role was the occasional existence of brewsters, or female brewers. Historians still argue whether medieval women, despite their subordinate legal status, wielded significant informal power within their households and communities, particularly through their roles in managing resources and raising children. Having explored the lives of medieval men, women, and children, let's now settle into the very spaces they inhabited. The medieval home. Forget spacious, well-lit, centrally heated abodes with running water and private bedrooms. For the vast majority of people, your home was a cramped, dark, damp, and often smoky shelter, a testament to the bare necessities of survival against the elements. Imagine your typical peasant or small craftsman's dwelling. Built from whatever local materials were readily available, timber frames filled with wattle and daub, or perhaps rough-hewn stone in rockier regions. The roof would be thatched with straw or reeds, which offered some insulation, but was prone to leaks and a favorite nesting spot for vermin. There was no foundation as we understand it. The floor was simply packed earth, perpetually damp and churned into mud in wet weather. Windows were often just unglazed openings, covered with wooden shutters in cold weather, or perhaps a piece of oiled animal skin to let in a tiny bit of diffused light, while keeping out the worst of the wind and rain. Glass windows were an extreme luxury, reserved for castles and cathedrals. This meant the interior was perpetually dim, even in the middle of the day. The central feature of your home, and its primary source of warmth, light, and cooking, was the open hearth. This fire, usually burning in the middle of the floor, had no chimney in many early medieval homes. The smoke simply rose to the roof and was expected to filter out through a hole or through the thatch itself. This meant the air inside was constantly thick with choking smoke and soot, leading to chronic respiratory problems for everyone living there, a constant low-level irritation to your eyes and lungs. You'd emerge from your home each morning smelling strongly of wood smoke. There was virtually no furniture as we know it. A simple wooden table, a few stools, perhaps a rough chest for storing what few possessions you owned. Beds were often just straw pallets laid on the floor, shared by the entire family, sometimes even with small livestock for warmth. Privacy was a non-existent concept. Everyone lived, ate, slept, and often worked within the confines of this single shared space. A rather unsettling, yet historically consistent aspect of medieval homes was the constant presence of vermin. Rats, mice, fleas, and lice thrived in these conditions, drawn by food scraps, straw bedding, and the lack of sanitation. They were not just a nuisance. They were carriers of disease, contributing to the poor health and short lifespans of the inhabitants. Imagine trying to sleep with the constant scuttling and gnawing of rodents, and the incessant itching from insect bites. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of sophisticated domestic comfort in medieval homes was primarily due to a lack of technological advancement or a deliberate, cultural choice, prioritizing communal living and durability over individual comfort. Regardless, your medieval home was a stark reminder of your place in the world. A functional, it's a basic shelter against the elements, but far from a sanctuary of warmth, cleanliness, or privacy. It was a place for survival, a roof over your head and little else. If your home offered little in the way of comfort or privacy, then the medieval world's approach to education offered even less in the way of opportunity for the likes of you. Forget public schools, free textbooks, or the idea that learning was a universal right. You learned how to survive, how to work the land, how to mend a fence, how to spin wool, or how to pump bellows for your father at the forge. Skills essential for your assigned role in society, not abstract concepts or academic theories. There were no lessons in history, no mathematics beyond basic counting for trade, and certainly no science or literature in the way we understand them today. Your knowledge was passed down orally, through observation, and by endless repetition of practical tasks. Regardless, for you, the common person, intellectual pursuits were a luxury you couldn't afford. Your mind was focused on the practicalities of daily survival, not on philosophical debates or the intricacies of grammar. The world of knowledge was largely closed off, leaving you to rely on tradition, hearsay, and the pronouncements of those few who held the keys to literacy and understanding. Your education was etched onto your calloused hands and weary body, not in books or formal lessons. For the vast majority of medieval people, the concept of formal education was almost entirely alien, a luxury reserved for a tiny, privileged elite. If you could even sign your name, you were considered remarkable. These were primarily for boys destined for the clergy, or for the sons of wealthy nobles who would become administrators or knights. These were not books in the modern sense, but small wooden paddles with a sheet of parchment or paper, pasted onto them displaying the alphabet, the Lord's Prayer, or a few simple verses. They were a rare and treasured tool for teaching basic literacy to those few fortunate enough to receive any formal instruction. Here, they might learn Latin, basic arithmetic, rhetoric, and theology. But for the peasant child, or even the aspiring craftsman, such institutions were as distant and unattainable as the moon. Books were incredibly expensive, painstakingly copied by hand, and kept locked away in monasteries or the private libraries of the nobility. The few texts that circulated were primarily religious or legal documents far beyond the reach or understanding of most. The notion of reading for pleasure or for gaining knowledge about the wider world was simply not a part of your reality. Imagine growing up in your medieval village. Your education was practical and immediate. Literacy, the ability to read and write, was extremely rare among the common folk. Formal schools where they existed were almost exclusively run by the church or attached to cathedrals and monasteries. A quirky, yet revealing aspect of medieval education for some children was the use of hornbooks. Historians still argue whether the widespread illiteracy of the medieval population was a deliberate tool of social control by the elite, or simply a consequence of the economic and technological limitations of the era. After the arduous toil of your day, the pervasive discomfort of your home, and the crushing weight of societal limitations, what solace could you, the medieval commoner, find in entertainment? Forget streaming services, concert halls, or even widespread public gatherings. Medieval entertainment was a simple, scarce, and often ephemeral affair, woven into the fabric of daily life, rather than a separate, dedicated pursuit. Imagine the end of a long day at the forge. There's no easy way to unwind. Your primary form of relaxation might be gathering with family and neighbors around the hearth, sharing stories and local gossip. Oral tradition was paramount. Tales of saints, brave knights, local heroes, or even bawdy jokes would be recited, passed down through generations. These stories, often accompanied by a weak ale, were your movies, your podcasts, and your news all rolled into one. The sheer power of a good storyteller was immense, capable of transporting you, however briefly, from the harsh realities of your existence. Music was another common diversion, though rarely performed by professional musicians for a common audience. It was more often a communal activity. Simple songs sung at harvest festivals, mournful laments at funerals, or lively tunes for dancing during village celebrations. Someone might own a flute, a drum, or a lute, providing accompaniment. These moments of collective joy, however fleeting, were vital for social cohesion and stress relief. Public spectacles, while rare, were immensely popular. If a traveling minstrel or jester came through your village, it would be an event to remember. They would perform juggling acts, tell jokes, sing ballads, and perhaps even perform crude theatrical skits. These were your circuses and stand-up comedy shows, drawing eager crowds despite often being performed on a makeshift stage in the village square. Religious feast days and local fairs also offered opportunities for communal celebration, with simple games, competitions, and perhaps even a wrestling match or a cockfight. Quirky and perhaps slightly dangerous form of medieval entertainment was bear baiting. This involved tying a bear to a stake and setting dogs upon it, a brutal spectacle enjoyed by both commoners and nobility alike. It highlights the vastly different sensibilities and ethical frameworks of the era compared to today, where such activities are rightly considered barbaric. Historians still argue whether the perceived simplicity of medieval entertainment was a sign of a less sophisticated culture or a testament to human resilience and the ability to find joy in basic communal activities. What is clear is that your entertainment wasn't consumed passively. It was often participatory, a shared experience that brought people together. These moments of respite, however brief and unsophisticated, were crucial for breaking the relentless monotony and hardship of medieval life. They were reminders that even in a world defined by struggle, the human spirit still sought connection, laughter, a brief escape from the ever-present realities of daily survival. If the daily toil, harsh justice, and scarce entertainment weren't enough to make medieval life a continuous struggle, then the most terrifying and omnipresent force of all was disease. Forget the concept of modern medicine, vaccines, or even basic hygiene. In the Middle Ages, illness was not merely an inconvenience. It was the invisible killer, a relentless reaper that stalked every family, every village, and every major city, often wiping out huge swaths of the population with horrifying speed and brutality. Imagine a persistent cough that turns into difficulty breathing, or a small fever that quickly escalates into delirium. This theory, while incorrect, did sometimes lead to efforts to remove refuse and improve ventilation, which by sheer coincidence might have offered some marginal benefit in preventing the spread of actual germs, even if for the wrong reasons. Regardless, the fear of disease was a constant underlying anxiety for every man, woman, and child. You lived with the knowledge that at any moment an invisible enemy could strike, bringing swift, agonizing death, leaving your family broken and your life's work unfinished. It was a world where survival was often less about strength and skill, and more about sheer, brutal luck against an unseen foe. In a world without understanding of germs, viruses, or sanitation, diseases spread unchecked. The sheer speed of death and the lack of understanding led to widespread panic. Superstitious beliefs and desperate, futile attempts at prevention or cure. People might wear strong-smelling herbs, flagellate themselves to appease God, or simply flee, often unknowingly carrying the disease with them. The most infamous, of course, was the Black Death, a mainstream historical fact that utterly decimated Europe in the mid-14th century. This wasn't just a bad flu season, it was a cataclysm. The bubonic plague, carried by fleas on rats, caused painful swellings in the armpits and groin. It's followed by fever, chills, and often agonizing death within days. The pneumonic form attacked the lungs, spreading through the air with every cough, killing even faster. The scale of the devastation was unimaginable. Entire villages could be wiped out, fields left untended, and workshops like your forge left silent as master and apprentice alike succumbed. But the plague was not the only killer. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, tuberculosis, influenza. These were constant companions, endemic in the population. A simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. Poor nutrition, especially during periods of famine, weakened immune systems, making everyone more susceptible. The lack of clean drinking water meant that waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery were rampant, particularly in more populated areas. Imagine trying to work your forge with a debilitating case of dysentery, or watching your children succumb to a fever you simply couldn't comprehend, let alone cure. A grimly fascinating yet morbidly quirky tidbit about medieval disease was the widespread belief in miasma theory. The idea that diseases were caused by bad air or foul smells emanating from decaying matter. Historians still argue whether the cyclical nature of medieval plagues was primarily due to a lack of public health infrastructure, or if specific climatic and environmental factors played a larger role in their recurrence. Given the relentless assault of daily toil, the pervasive reach of disease, and the constant threat of famine and warfare, it comes as no surprise that the most sobering truth about medieval life was the incredibly short life expectancy. Forget the notion of retirement or a leisurely old age. For the vast majority of people, your time on Earth was a brief, arduous flicker, often extinguished before what we would consider true adulthood. Imagine yourself, the weary blacksmith, looking around your village. How many truly old people do you see? Very few. A mainstream historical fact is that average life expectancy in the medieval period hovered around 30 to 35 years of age. This isn't to say no one lived longer. Some individuals, particularly those of noble birth with better nutrition and less strenuous lives, might reach their 50s, 60s, or even rarely beyond. But for the common peasant, craftsman, or laborer, reaching 40 was a significant achievement, and 50 was practically ancient. This low average was heavily skewed by the terrifying rates of infant and child mortality. As we discussed, a huge proportion of children died before the age of 5. If you survived the perils of childhood, your chances of living longer improved somewhat. But you were still constantly exposed to dangers. A simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. A common cold could turn into pneumonia. A broken bone could mean crippling disability or death. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of hygiene, and no safety nets. The physical demands of your work as a blacksmith, combined with poor nutrition and constant exposure to smoke and fumes, meant your body was often worn out by the time you reached your late 30s or early 40s. Your joints would ache, your back would be permanently stooped, your lungs would labor, and your teeth would be long gone. You were old before your time, physically broken by a life of unremitting labor. A poignant yet quirky detail found in medieval wills or charters is the occasional mention of provisions for the re-aged and infirm, which sometimes referred to individuals in their late 30s or 40s, who were already unable to work due to physical decline. This highlights how swiftly age and infirmity could set in, forcing people to rely on charity or the support of their immediate family. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism and resignation to early death in medieval society was a genuine cultural acceptance or simply a necessary coping mechanism for a reality that offered little hope of longevity. Regardless, for you, the individual, every morning you awoke was a small victory. Every year you survived a testament to your hardiness. Your world was one where death was a familiar neighbor, always lurking, always ready to claim its due. There was little time for long-term planning, for grand ambitions beyond the immediate need to survive. Life was lived in the present, each day a small battle against the inevitable, against a future that was always short, often painful, and ultimately deeply uncertain. As the last embers of the forge die down and the final echoes of the hammer fade, we arrive at the end of our journey through the harsh realities of medieval life. You, the blacksmith, battered and weary, stand as a testament to the sheer endurance of the human spirit in an age that offered precious little comfort or security. It was the strength found in community, in families huddling together for warmth, sharing meager meals, and enduring collective hardships. It was the satisfaction of craftsmanship, the pride in taking raw, unyielding iron regardless. Your ancestors, living in such unforgiving times, possessed a profound capacity for persistence. Let the harshness of that past era recede, replaced by a sense of calm and a quiet appreciation for the present. The clang of the anvil is gone, the smoke is cleared, and the medieval blacksmith, weary but resolute, has finally found his rest. Let the quiet darkness embrace you, and find solace in the stillness that now surrounds you. They built the foundations of the world we know, not with machines, but with muscle, sweat, and an indomitable will to carry on day after agonizing day. They remind us of the immense progress made, but also the enduring human capacity to adapt, to survive, and to find meaning even in the bleakest of circumstances, and shaping it into something vital and useful, a tool, a hinge, a plowshare that would help feed your village. Though unseen by historians, the small triumphs of daily life, the moments of shared laughter.
Hi.
Around a smoky hearth, the simple beauty of a sunrise over fields you helped to cultivate. These were the threads of joy woven into the tough fabric of existence. You've seen the relentless grind, the pervasive dirt, the constant threat of injury, illness, and famine. You felt the oppressive weight of feudal lords and the all-encompassing presence of the church. Your life was a continuous battle against forces both seen and unseen, a struggle for mere survival against overwhelming odds. Yet, amidst all this hardship, there was also a quiet strength, a resilient spirit that pulsed through the medieval world. You forged not just iron, but connections. You were indispensable to your community, a linchpin in a world reliant on handcrafted skill. Remember the shared ale, the whispered stories, the communal effort of a harvest? These were the glue that held society together when everything else threatened to pull it apart. The lack of modern conveniences meant a deeper reliance on each other, a direct understanding of interdependence. You provided the means for farming, for building, for defense, and in return, the community provided your meager sustenance and essential, if basic, support. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more resilient to suffering due to constant exposure, or if the psychological toll of such a hard life was simply masked by a lack of historical documentation. Now, as the imagery of the medieval forge fades and the echoes of that long-ago struggle begin to quiet, feel the gentle hum of your modern world.